Okay, let's get started. I will pass the roll around, but also I'm going to pass your presentation list around, if they'll stay in one piece here. Some of you have had questions about when your assignment's coming up. You should have written that down someplace, but you have not. So let me pass it around. And let me point out that A, C, D. That, I can't remember if this is the first week, I guess maybe this is the second week of it. But anyway, you are now, some of you are sharing a chapter with somebody else because I want that chapter covered very well. And so, for example, this week, there will be first off, the second part of the chapter 10 will be presented this week. Oh, excuse me, this week, excuse me. This week it'll be the second part of the headline chapter, that's chapter 9. And the second presenter is covering the second half of that chapter, covering subtitles, captions, blurbs, whereas last week we had class anyway, somebody already covered headlines per se. And then the second presentation this week will be about using photos. And that also is split with somebody else, that's chapter 10, and somebody else is using graphics, type, and other things besides photos. And so this person doing the second half of chapter 10 will be presenting next week. So if you haven't realized that, you should double check. Everybody should double check. Anybody who has not presented, double check when you're to present, first off. And secondly, if you are dividing a chapter with somebody, you better figure out who you're dividing with and get together with them. I'm not telling you which pages. You guys can get together and decide where to split your chapter. So I'm letting you guys decide that. Also coming up soon are the people that are supposed to be presenting out of this book. There's two people also presenting out of this book. It's a short book, and so it's would be divided in half also. The Anatomy of Modern Newspaper Design. If you want to borrow that book, you can very quickly to photocopy it. However, you really don't need to probably because it is right here on your Moodle site. And so the entire book has been photocopied or scanned, I guess you'd say, so that you don't have to make a copy of it yourself. It's right there for you. This one, there's the first part would end. I mean, they have part 1, part 2, and part 3, and part 2 and 3 are quite short. So the first person will take part 1, and the second person will take parts 2 and 3 because they're shorter. So that you should already have. Nonetheless, if somebody wants to borrow the book, here it is. I am running into a problem this morning. What I wanted to do was to do another demonstration of how to do your page. However, I had a month-long subscription to Quark, and I just realized as I opened my computer this morning that apparently it ran out. So I can't open Quark. I need to get it reloaded. I need to get it uploaded like the rest of you, or like many of you have from our full subscription. So I can't demonstrate how to do it again. However, I shouldn't really need to. I'm going to talk about some of the things I've seen. I did send you out an email or a message through Moodle talking about some of the things I was seeing, but I want to reemphasize some of the keys that the mistakes that I'm seeing so far, because some of those mistakes are being made by really good students who come every day and I presume are listening, but they're still making major mistakes. And so if the good students are making major mistakes, I have to believe that others who are not trying as hard, who may not attend like this morning session and stuff, are going to make worse mistakes. So I want to talk about that. I'd still prefer to do it, as I said, in a demonstration format of actually redoing the page, but I can't. It was still working the other day, but apparently, like today is, apparently it's first day of not working. I need to get it reloaded. So I'm going to bring up the version I did do and suggest that if you want to see how to do this, that you actually go back to the design critique sheet, because many of you are ignoring the design critique sheet as you're doing this, for those that I've seen anyway. So I'll go back and forth a little bit, and I need you to ask questions. If there's something you do not understand in the critique sheet, then ask me, for heaven's sake. You're being Asian shy. It does not do you any favor when it comes to something like this. You need to ask questions if you don't understand something. In fact, let me start off right now. Is there anything you don't understand that you need me to explain? At any time during our discussion today, please interrupt me if there's something you don't understand. Okay, so the first thing, I'm just going to go quickly. We've gone through this before. If you were attending your tutorial, I went through part of it in here, and I went through part in the tutorial, I believe, as I recall. So I'm going to just very quickly refer back to Part A, 25% of your grade, is the basic design appearance. Some of the keys to that then are, first off, you need the dominant graphic at top. One of the problems I've seen in the few that people have passed by me to get some quick review, and I'm delivering my review to you too. I can't look at every one before you hand it in. There's no way I can look at 95 papers before they actually come into me. I've got way too much other things to do. But some that I've seen, the photos have been essentially the same size. Now, that makes for a boring page. You need to have, and I've gone through it before, and way back, I don't know, a long time ago, I showed you a photo page, for example, and the difference between what would be basically a family photo album and a professional photo page. And the big difference was it took the biggest photo and blew it up big and made some smaller in order to make it fit. And that's also, we talked about that when I went through that design of the baseball page, the sports page, and where that, I think in every case they had a big picture in that case, but sometimes at the bottom, someplace it was buried, whatever. You need a center of focus, which almost by definition means you need a bigger picture. If you don't have one picture that's substantially bigger than other ones, then you don't have a center of focus. Well, it's hard to come up with a center of focus. Let's take a look at mine. I think I apologize because I don't think I had enough of a center of focus. But let's take a step back here and take a look. So it definitely, there's a bigger one than, and I think maybe I started off with it not being big enough, and then I went back and recropped and made it a little bit bigger. Or made the one above it a little bit smaller. I don't remember. I think I started off with somewhat the same problem, but there is a center of focus. There's two things about this picture that makes it a center focus. One, it is bigger in size, but also the image inside the photo is bigger. So you have this guy being thrown up in the air as they win their championship game or whatever. And so you have a very big image within that photo. None of the other photos have as anywhere close to as big an image within the photo. So sometimes when you're looking at a photo that dominates, it's as much about what's inside the photo as it is the size of the photo. Because if the image in the photo is really small, for example, if I put this football picture up in the upper right and I replace where it is now with the photo of the gal standing by the mountains, it might, that one went up there, it might seem more dominant than this one there, even though this one would be bigger. The image inside that picture is so small that there would be a competition between the one at the top and the one what's now the center focus because of the image inside of it. And so you want a bigger picture, and you want to make sure that other pictures don't have such big images in them that they compete for it, even if they're a little bit smaller, which they could do. So this then relates to that first part. Another, talking about design, headlines, basically headlines are the same rule almost. You need dominant headlines, and you need contrast in headlines. You need contrast in photos, you need contrast in headlines. You can't have all your headlines the same size. It's not going to look good if you have all your headlines the same size or anywhere close to the same size. You need to have variation in your headline. So here we have the big headline up at top. The headline below the center focus, the big picture, is not a lot smaller. It is a little bit smaller, but it's also not bold-faced. And so it seems smaller, at least it's much less dominant because it's light-faced instead of bold-faced. Excuse me, the one at the top, I believe, was Arial black. So it wasn't just bold, it was black is even thicker and bigger. And so the Arial black in the top is much more dominant than the photo underneath the football player. And you see the photos, or the headlines, they don't go down exactly in order, but they trend smaller as they go down lower in the page. If I had a larger headline over the runner story, the marathon runner story, that would be okay if I had a 36-point headline there. Then you have a big one at top, you have another one at the bottom. That's okay. So it doesn't have to go exactly in order from top to bottom, big to small, by any means. And part of that will relate to how wide the photos are. A wider photo it's easier to make a bigger headline than a narrow photo. So the 2-column photos you see here tend to be smaller than the 4-column photos, or 4-column headlines, I mean. 4-column headlines, true would be true for photos too that relates to them, but the ones in 2 columns are smaller, the headlines are smaller than the ones in 4 columns. It's just easier to write 4-column headlines, and and they kind of, if they don't dictate a bigger headline, they benefit from a bigger headline because the whole package is a little bit bigger. And so a little bit bigger headline is good. And so I don't remember exactly what sizes I had these at, but the rule, if I let me go back, well, let me wait a second to go to headlines in a second. It does talk about headlines under the first section, but where I start talking about sizes exactly is in part 3. So I'm going to continue here. Some of you had problem. You didn't keep the few that I've glanced at so far did not keep your story under the headline. There was at least again, I've just looked at a couple of them, but one of them had a headline that went across, I think, 3 columns, and then they let the story come up next to the headline. So the headline covered 3 of 4 columns, but not the 4th column. And you'd say, well, you should be able to figure that out. No, I couldn't, actually. I had to actually go select the text to figure out where that 4th column went with, because it was so close to the bottom of the column of the story above it that I actually did have to try to figure out for sure where that column was going. Was it part of the story above it, and the person was not keeping modularity, was not keeping the story above it square or rectangular, or was it part of the story that the headline did not cover? And indeed, it was modular, but it was left the reader confusing, me, the reader at that time. So the rule is the headline goes above the entire story unless you box it. If it doesn't go across the entire story, box it. That's the rule. And that's why you do not confuse your readers. You don't make your readers think 2 seconds about where does this story go now. You don't make them think 2 seconds about it. You make your layout so clear that they do not have to think when it comes to knowing, where the stories, what columns or whatever, what text goes with what story, and which photos go with which story, things like that. Not 2 seconds. So if your headline does not cover the entire story, box the entire story with a graphic box. That relates to some of the other things as far as not confusing your reader, keeping modularity. That's kind of part of it too. If everything's modular, then it's easier for people not to be confused. And modular again means rectangular, but it is possible to confuse somebody even if everything's rectangular, as the one person's page looked did confuse me. Be sure to make white space purposeful, or don't leave white space. So an example of purposeful is what I did up here with this caption. This is okay. Putting that caption up in the upper right with leaving a little bit of white space is considered good use of white space. But if you just use white space or leave white space at the bottom of a story, no, there's no excuse for that. There's no reason for it. There's no excuse for it. Be sure to either make your white space purposeful or don't leave white space. Fill it up. There's a number of things you can do. If this story, let's say this story here, did not fill this space, I can take this photo and make it larger. And even though it comes over into the second column, or the first column actually in this case, that's okay. I can bring it over and just push the text over a little bit. I might have to redo the subheadline, but other than subheadline, it would be okay. I can just put the text around, have it come into the text, make sure that I've used Quark. What do they call it? Anyway, that I push the text away from it, kind of the envelope around it. I forget what they call it now, but that I use that little envelope to push the text away from the photo, so the text is not touching the photo. But I can put that photo, like you say, go into that next column over if I need to fill the space. There's lots of ways you can, use photos as to how you crop them. If you, one of my favorite things actually is to take a photo like this and put it right in the middle of the text. So the left column is wrapping around to the left side and the right column is wrapping around to the right side. And it's here kind of sitting in the middle of it. That's easy to do, and of course it might allow you to make it a little bit bigger. Be sure to lay out your page so that the biggest headlines, again, the very biggest one does not necessarily need to be the top one. Instead of the top one, I could have that one a little bit smaller and have the biggest, boldest one underneath the football photo, or in the 2-column story right here. If I wanted to make this the biggest headline, I could do that. But one of these 3 stories at the top half of the page has to be bigger and bolder than the others. This one's pretty low on the page. The one with the football is a little bit low on the page. It definitely needs to be above the halfway point on the page. And this is barely, I think, well, the headline, I'm not sure the headline is. The photo is mostly above the midway point. I'm not sure the headline is. So if it's not, then it's just between these two stories has to be the biggest, boldest headline. So the biggest, boldest headline should be at the top half of the page. Okay. As far as being graphically pleasing, subheadlines are partly that. They are a graphic element, but they're also, that's the norm nowadays to have subheadlines or summary sentences. One person tried doing summary sentences and they really didn't get it. A summary sentence is not take a sentence out of your story and put it above the byline and make it bigger and bolder. That's not a summary sentence. The reason why I encourage you not to use a summary sentence is it's actually harder to write a summary sentence, especially if English is not your first language. It's harder than a subheadline for me, although English is my first language, because now you're having to try to write a summary sentence that is as powerful as your lead, but is not overly redundant to your lead. And that's difficult to do. You've already found the whammy. If you've done a good job of identifying and finding the whammy and making sure your lead emphasizes the whammy, then what do you emphasize in the summary? It's hard to come up with something new. And so for myself, that's harder than a subheadline, because a subheadline can be a little bit redundant. Headlines tend to be somewhat redundant, but summary sentences shouldn't be, at least not terribly. At least they have to be written in such a totally different way that it does not seem too redundant. And so a summary sentence is actually harder than a subheadline, so I discourage you from trying to do it. But the one that I saw, the one that somebody did try to do summary headline, did not do it right. Either the summary sentence was basically they just cut and pasted the lead above the byline, which is not the point of a summary sentence. It is the lead is still with the story. The summary sentence has to be different and distinct from the lead. So it is a little more complicated, and I'd say more difficult, especially for somebody for whom English is not their first language, to write a good summary sentence and not have grammatical problems and not be overly redundant. So I really discourage you from trying to write a summary sentence. I don't think most of you are ready for that. So I would encourage you instead to use the subheadline. That's easier, I think. That's my opinion. If you want to do it, you have to keep the rules, and that is, if you're going to do a summary sentence, first off, it has to be bigger than it, so that the body text has to be 10 point. By the way, somebody made theirs smaller to make things fit. The body text has to be 10 point. That's their style. A person on one page can't use 10 point, somebody on the other page use 9 point. You can't do that in a publication. So everybody has to be a 10 point Times New Roman body text. You will be penalized if you do anything other than that. That's our style. Every newspaper, every publication has a style. Our style is Times New Roman 10 point for the body text. Other than that, our headlines are Arial, but you get to size them in a variety of ways, covered by page 2 of our critique sheet. But there's rules for that too. So, yeah. Oh, and the other thing then, so it has to be, your summary sentence should be at least 12 or 14 point bold if you're going to do a summary sentence. And it's also possible, by the way, some do more than one sentence in their summary. But I don't think that's easier. I think that's harder. So I don't know if you're going to do that. I think doing 2 sentences is still even harder than doing one, and one is harder than doing a subheadline. So I don't encourage that either. Okay, going back, let me go back to the design critique sheet. Tombstoning, there was, I think the reason why the person who did not have the headline all the way over was that they were trying to avoid tombstoning. But instead, they broke a different rule, that's all. The rules have a reason. You don't confuse the reader. Therefore, you either box the story or you put a headline all the way across the top. You don't tombstone, having two stories next to each other. Or what do? You box one of the stories. So in either case, you end up boxing a story. Now, perhaps the person whose page I looked at wasn't sure how to box a story, and I'm sorry, Quark is not working for me today, but you can go back and look at my original demonstration. What you're going to do is you're going to pull out of the ruler. You can pull guides out of the ruler and put them any place you want them. And so you put your graphic box along the column guides, whether it's 1 column, 2 column, 3 column, whatever. You put the graphic box, make them line up with the column guides, and then you pull one of those green rulers out of the ruler, green ruler guide, and you put that just a little bit to the right of the graphic box on the right side, and another one a little bit to the left of the graphic box on the left side, and you line up your stories with those graphic boxes. Now, there's actually another reason why. I know that's unnecessarily confusing. I won't confuse you. Anyway, so I'll leave that there. So just, you have to make sure that neither your photo, and again, I'll blow this up so you can take a look at what I did, but neither your photo, nor your caption, nor your headline, nor your body text can be touching the graphic box. But it isn't that hard. If you have, again, pulled out a ruler guide from the ruler and put it right, just a little bit, where mine was right here where you see everything lining up to on the left side, and right here where you see everything lining up to on the right side, I put the ruler guides there, and that allowed me to put that. For one thing, we talked about a little bit, the Quark is built with what they call a snap. When you're putting text boxes in, they tend to snap to a guide. And so if you don't put that ruler guide there, it may be difficult for you to keep that text box from snapping over to the column guide. And now you can do it if you blow it up big enough. The bigger you blow your image, the closer you can get to a guide without it snapping to the guide. You also, under Quark, can go up and turn off the snap. It's over on the right side. I can't remember which menu it's under with Quark, but you can turn off the snaps if you want to. All the snaps. There's multiple snaps. And so if the snap is bothering you, if it's jumping over to a guide that you don't want it to jump to, you can turn it off. But it's easier to pull out from the ruler guide, put a ruler guide where you want it to be, and then your text box will jump to the ruler guide. And so the ruler guide will stop it from jumping all the way over to the column guide next to it. You follow that? Have you done enough with Quark to where you understand what I'm talking about? But it has a snap trait to it. So does InDesign, by the way. Not just Quark, but I think all desktop publishing is built with a snap to it. So you can line things up with guides, with column guides or ruler guides or whatever. This is not peculiar to Quark. And they're doing it as a favor to you, so you can line everything up so all your stories line up with a guide, all your columns line up with a guide, easier than if you had no snap function to it. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to the critique sheet, and this week we'll start talking about graphics, about photographs and other graphics. I've kind of already covered this as part of the design, but a couple of points I'll just reemphasize. First off, you have to have contrast. You need big photos and small ones. We already talked about that. You need captions. One of the pages somebody showed me real quick had no captions. That's a major deduction if you don't have captions. So you have to write captions. Now, in our class, we had the writers were supposed to write those captions. So most of your stories should have captions with them. So that should be the easy thing, is to have captions, because it's already been done in most cases. We talked several times about, well, let me go with 13 first, enhancing the power of the graphic. One of the main things you do there is, again, decide what should remain in the photo. What image do you want to focus on? What space do you want to cut out? Especially dead space is automatic almost. You want dead space out of there. If part of that photo has no purpose, get rid of it. You have to crop it out. If you don't know how to crop in Quark, again, I showed you in my demo. There's also other links to YouTube videos that show how to do that. So don't just put your graphic in and leave it uncropped. You'll get punished for that too. You need to crop your photos appropriately. I'm not going to be real hard-hearted in this, but one of them I remember was just all sorts of dead. It was a team photo, I think, and there's like a quarter of the photo on the right empty and a quarter of the photo on the left empty, and the image of this group image in the center was rather, you could hardly see the faces. Well, that's the definition of why you need to crop a photo and enlarge the image inside of it. Is that if you're going to have a group photo, you need to enlarge it so you can see the faces. Otherwise, there's no purpose having a group photo. I mean, I don't like group photos anyway. But if you're going to have a group photo, you need to have the images big enough you can see the faces. And so first, there's two things to that. First off, a photo with 12 people in it cannot be in a one column for sure. It's probably not good to have it in a two column. With 12 people in it, probably at least 3 columns. You might get away with 2, but it would not be a good photo in 2 columns. 3 columns would be, if you're going to have 12 people, 12 heads in that, it almost certainly needs 3 columns. Because otherwise the heads are going to be too small. Even if you do a good job at cropping, they're going to be too small. If you don't crop, then it's worse. Looking off the page, we talked about that before, and I showed you what to do about that. You can flop a photo within Quark. You can flop it, and of course you can do it in Earthman View. Either way, you can do it before you put it on the page in Earthman View, or you can do it after you put it on the page, and I showed how to do that on the demo as well. I've talked a little bit about pull-out quotes, but I'm not going to try to cover that today. I obviously did all of mine without a pull-out quote. You can do all yours this time without a pull-out quote, but we'll maybe encourage you to use a pull-out quote in your next project to know how that you can do it. So let's talk about headlines. Again, I think both of the few pages I've looked at already have all had headlines too small, I believe, as I recall. If they haven't, I know one of them definitely did. Small and all about the same size. So they did not contrast, and they were all less than 36 point. I've said multiple times that the top headline, or at least the biggest headline, the dominant headline in your story has to be at least 36 point. And in a broadsheet, it should be bigger than 36 point. When I say 36 point, I'm mostly thinking about tabloid, because I've been working in tabloid the last few years, and because I've only had students working in tabloid before, I never bothered to take them up to broadsheet. I just stayed with tabloid size, which is half the size of a broadsheet. And so even with a tabloid that is half the size of a broadsheet, not in width but overall size, so with about the same columns, a tabloid's 4 columns and a broadsheet 6 columns. So in that sense, you could say the width anyway is about 2/3 the size. But even with that, 36 should be the smallest headline you have in a tabloid. A broadsheet, that's small. Anything smaller than that is too small as a dominant headline, too small. So please look at these rules. These rules will be enforced. If you don't understand them, ask them. So 120 there. Let's go through these rules again so that you understand what I'm expecting. And these are not just my rules, by the way. I did change one. But other than that, these are approximately the same rules that were in the textbook excerpt that I showed a couple of weeks ago. I happen to agree with them, but it was in a textbook. In fact, it's a textbook that is in the library about layout. I forget the name of it exactly, but it's a spiral-bound book on layout. That's the book where I took pages out of, although not from this library, from a different library. But these are mostly their rules, but also my rules. I agree with them and I adopted them. So as we look at these rules, if it's 6 columns, that's only in a broadsheet because a tabloid only has 4 columns. So in the top 2 up here, I had to add these this semester because I never taught broadsheet before. I've only taught tabloid. So on a broadsheet, if it's 6-column headline, towards the top of the page, it should be at least 36, but could easily be 72. It could be bigger than 72. I probably shouldn't have put 72, other than just give you an idea that 72 is not bad. But especially if you're going to do like a hammerhead, you can have a hammerhead that's 96 or over 100 point. Again, 72 is 1 inch. I know you guys aren't used to using inches, but that's what it's equivalent to. So that's about 1 inch. So from the top ascender to the bottom descender of a headline is 1 inch. So 72 isn't really all that big. For the hammerhead, you could go 50% bigger. You could go easily over 100 point with a hammerhead. And by the way, again, I demonstrated repeatedly, but Quark has certain headline sizes, so does InDesign, by the way. But you can put any point size in there you want to. Just type it in. And so even though it goes from 72 to, it may drop all the way to 48. I can't remember if it has any, maybe it has 60. I don't remember if it has anything between 72 and 48. Our old style, when we did not have desktop publishing, it basically dropped that much. From a 72 point down to 48 point, and we could not go in between. We had to try to size our headlines exactly, had to word them exactly to fit the space, and we only had the options that we had. So a 72 had to stay 72. We couldn't make it 71. In desktop publishing, you can make 71, in fact, you can make it 71 and a half if you want to. So in desktop publishing, you have the luxury of making your headline any size you want, basically. In the old days, we could not do that. But still, Windows and Adobe and Quark kind of mimic what we used to have, only limited sizes. And so their sizes they automatically show you are the sizes we used to only have. But you're not limited by that anymore. You can put any size in there you want to. So again, let's going back up here, at the top of the page, 36 in broadsheet is small. I still allow it, but it's small for a broadsheet. You should be trying to go in the 40s at least. If you're, I think my top headline, first off I put it into Arial black, so it was really bold, but it's also, I think, 45 point. So I pushed it over 40. I did not stay with 36 by any means. Actually, I don't change a thing with 5 columns. The same sizes. With the top of the page, 36 to 72. Bottom of the page, nothing under 24. Okay, some of the headlines I've seen, even at the top of the page, are lower than 24. I do not, I'm not saying nobody ever wrote a headline like a 1-column headline, less than 24, especially a 1-column. But as a professional, you have to try to avoid going that small. You need to try to get it at even a 1-column headline at least 24 point, if it's at the top of the page, for sure. Now, if it's 6 or 5 or 6 columns at the bottom of the page, like I said, I start at 24, and you can still go to 36, but you don't go to 36 at the bottom of the page unless your top headline at the top of the page is bigger than 36, or at least blacker and bolder than 36. So the dominant headline still has to be in the top half of the page, but like in my case, I have a 45 bold, or black actually, in the top, therefore I could easily have a 36 at the bottom, because the black 3045 point is going to dominate the page. My 36, if I wanted to, I don't think it was 36, going back and look at again, I think it was smaller, but I don't remember exactly what size this marathon was. I think it's over 30. It might be, I don't think it's 30, it'll be 36. But if it had been, it'd be okay there, because I had the 45 point Arial black on top. So it's okay. Going back to the rules again. Okay, where I changed it from the other textbook is with four column. I've added to it, and if you have the old version of the critique sheet, you won't have this, because I just changed this a week, I think maybe just last week. Is I'm allowing you to go two lines with 4 columns in broadsheet, only broadsheet, because 4 columns in tabloid is the whole width. And no, I don't want you to go if you're going the whole width in tabloid, then just keep the original rule by myself and by the other textbook was 1 line if it goes across 4 columns tabloid. But I think, well, I used it, and I told you as I was doing the demonstration I was going to change the rule, because as I started looking at this, I thought this was not a problem in a broadsheet, that having two lines of text here on this headline was not a bad thing. Even though it is 4 columns, so the textbook said no, 4 columns, only 1 line of text. But I decided to change that rule because I don't think it looks bad. I don't think there's a problem with having 2 lines there in a broadsheet. So only in the broadsheet. When we go to tabloid, then we go back to the other rule, which is only 1 line across 4 columns, because 4 columns is the entire width of the paper when we go to tabloid. Okay, so back again. So in 4 columns, I kept the point size the same. Now I would encourage you again, the wider you have, the more columns you have, the bigger you should be able to push it. And so I encourage you to push it bigger if you go over four columns. Still, the minimum size is still 36. If it's your main headline, your biggest headline, your dominant headline, it should be at least 36. But it can certainly be bigger, but it can be, again, if you go as I did, if your dominant headline is 45 point, then you can have another headline up there that's 36 point. But actually, once you establish your main headline, you can go less than 36 if it's not your main headline. You could go a little bit below that, but it should still be pretty good size. I would encourage you, if it's if it's 4 columns, I guess I would stick with the rule. Keep it 36 if it was 4 columns. But again, if there's another headline that you're trying to emphasize, that one should then be bigger than 36. So almost by definition, again, depending how you lay it out, if you have a 6-column headline and a 4-column headline, the 4-column headline should, by rule, be 36 point at least. That means your 6-column headline should be in the 40s, just to make contrast. Going to 3 columns, we're going back to what the textbook said, and I agree. 3 column, now you can go 2 lines for sure. Even in tabloid, you can go 2 lines instead of 1 line across 3 columns. And so I think what we have in the example, in my example. Okay, well, I didn't have a 3-column. We had 4 columns. I didn't actually have a 3-column. So I can't show off a 3-column at all. But a 3-column at the top, guess what it says? I probably should make this maybe a little bit smaller if it's not the dominant headline. If it's a dominant headline, definitely it needs to be at least 36 point. If it were not the dominant headline, and so you have a dominant headline and then you have one close to the fold, close to the halfway point, I probably wouldn't punish you if you're a little bit below 36 on a 3-column because there's a dominant headline that is more than 36 on in that same page. But still, 36 isn't all that big, and a broadsheet, I would still lean that way. In tabloid, I might be able to go a little smaller with a secondary headline that's not the main headline. With 2 columns, now you can go 2 to 3 lines. And so going back to my example, this is a 2-column headline here, has 3 lines. Up here we have another one, has 2 lines. The one up here has 3 lines. And so they're both within the rule. This one has 3 lines. This one has 2 lines. You do not go 1 line with a 2-column headline. No 1-line headlines with 2 columns. You need to go at least 2. And actually no more than 3. So your limit is 2 lines or 3 lines, not 1 line and not 4 lines. With a 2-column headline, it's 2 or 3, not 1 and not 4. 2 to 3. If you once you get to the 1 column, then it's 3 to 4 lines. So you see the narrower, in order to make a headline big enough graphically and also long enough to say what you want to say, the narrower the layout, the more lines of text you have. And so with 1 column, it's 3 or 4. 2 columns, it's 2 or 3. 3 columns, it's 1 or 2. And with 4 columns, I'm saying now with broadsheet only, also 1 or 2. Once we get to tabloid, then 4 columns goes down to 1 line only. Be sure that your headlines are active. That demands a verb. By definition, an active headline has to have a verb. Remember that past events in headlinees is present tense, is a present tense verb. Council decides to raise taxes. And a future headline is to raise taxes. Council to raise taxes. Blow this up a little bigger for you, sorry. Be sure to go through this headlineese part. We avoid a, and, or the articles in headlines. There are a few exceptions, but I have to agree with your exception. It has to just plain sound bad if it doesn't have a, or, and, or that. And maybe over the years of becoming a journalist, I have a better sense of what sounds bad in a headline. So I may disagree with you. But you don't use a, and the unless you feel compelled to, that you really have to, because it just sounds awkward not to. But most headlines you can do without them. So remember the verb usage. Now, again, I've said before, but let me reemphasize. With a hammerhead, do you have to have an active verb in a hammerhead? The answer is no. You have to have have an active verb in the subheadline then. So by definition, a hammerhead has to have a subheadline. A hammerhead cannot have a summary sentence and do it justice. So a hammerhead can be only 1 word or 2 words, maybe 3 words, probably the most. But you could even go for and cover and not really be exactly a hammerhead. It could be the full width and without an active verb, as long as you have a subheadline it's quite big and it has an active verb. Your headline has to carry the verb then if your hammerhead does not. And so there are places where you don't have active verbs, but either in your headline or your subheadline you have to have an active verb, one or the other. If you don't, you're going to get deductions from it. Capitalization, our style is sentence capitalization. There's 4 types of capitalization in newspapers. One is all caps, which means every letter is capitalized. The other one is title capitalization, like you may have learned in your English classes, to how you put titles in a book or a book title, where it's every main word, but you don't capitalize a, and, or the. You don't capitalize a few other words, maybe like that. So certain words in a title capitalization you don't capitalize, but you capitalize all the main words in a title capitalization. But actually, if you look at those 30 American papers, I've uploaded all of them into Moodle, by the way. I can't remember which week they're under. Might be under week 7, I don't remember. 7, 8, or 9, I'm sure, but in fact, I don't think it's 9, I think it's 7 or 8. But anyway, those 30 pages from American newspapers, front pages of American newspapers, I don't believe you'll see one title capitalization. That is totally passé now. Title capitalization does not exist in American newspapers anymore. If you find any at all, it'd be very few, if any. It seems like all capitalization is coming back, but I don't like it. So I encourage you to avoid all cap headlines. I advise you to go with sentence capitalization, which is the majority of all headlines. And when you do see an all cap headline in an American newspaper, there's usually not more than 1 to a page. But I personally don't think it looks good unless you're really shouting, "Look at me!" Then it goes all caps. And you don't say, "Look at me," unless it's really, really important. We don't do it for stupid reasons. And so if war has been declared, you can use all caps. It has to be really important in my book to use all caps. Because even in new media, that's what they say, don't put all caps in your email and stuff, because that's like shouting at somebody. Well, it's kind of the same rule. We don't shout at people unless we have a reason to shout at them. And all caps is shouting in text form. So I encourage you not to use all caps, because we don't have any stories worth shouting about. With the exception of hammerhead. Again, if you want to use a hammerhead, all caps, that's okay. You don't have to. It does not have to be all caps. But I would prefer, and to get to impress me the most, I would not use all caps except on a hammerhead. I'd say to me, that's still passé. To me, sentence capitalization is the easiest to read, and there's no reason to go to all caps unless you really do want to shout at people, and then shout at them. And in essence, that's what a hammerhead does, by the way. You are shouting at people. You're hammering people in a sense. So that's not you can use hammerheads without, in all caps, without it being a national emergency. That is more style. And typically, the hammerhead, if you're going to make it all caps, then it should only be 1 or 2 words. If you make it big and make it 4 words, it's really not a hammerhead anymore. It's just a big headline. But I still allow you to leave out the active verb in a big headline if you have the active verb in the subheadline. So even though it's not technically a hammerhead, if you go all the way across your page, it has kind of the same effect. I would not then make it all caps. I just make it a big headline, but it would be without a verb, very possibly. And the verb would go in the subheadline, which would also be quite big. And so if you're going to do that, the top headline without a verb might be 72 point. And what's the rule with subheadlines? They're approximately half the size of your main headline. That is not a hard and fast rule, but it is a rule you'll find in most textbooks about layout, that it should be somewhere around half the size of the main headline. So if you have a 72-point headline, you have a 36-point subheadline, approximately. And again, I would penalize you with that only if it just doesn't look right. And I don't know where I can tell you that it won't look right. You probably have quite a bit of leeway there. In that case I just gave you, you could probably go down to 30 point, and I wouldn't penalize you. If you had a 72-point main headline and a 30-point subheadline, you probably wouldn't get penalized. If you went to 24, it would look wrong, and then you would probably get penalized. So the general rule in all layout publications is about half the size of the main headline. Again here, and I think this is part of a revision, I did put, we normally use sentence capitalizations with all caps used with hammerheads or slammerheads, something like that. I don't think I've seen this problem in this class yet, but I probably will out of 95 papers to be handed in. Do not allow any word in a headline or subheadline to divide itself in hyphenation. Do not allow it to do that. That's against the rule. For sure, you'll be penalized if you allow a word in a headline or a subheadline to hyphenate when it goes to a second line or a third line, whatever it might be. So how do you break a line? I've told you already. Somebody tell me how you break a line without hitting. You don't just hit enter, because sometimes, in fact, I just noticed, I didn't realize this at the beginning, but this apparently, I did make that mistake. I'm just now noticing it. Notice the third line has extra space between it and the second line. I must not have, that must have broken, I don't know, I can't imagine myself just hitting enter. It may be that it was a bigger headline and that it has an empty space. Even spaces can be sized in desktop publishing. So it may have an empty space after the Y in festivity. That is, the empty space might be, a bigger size. And that's why it's giving me that false, that bad line spacing there. I'm not really sure. I'm going to have to go back to the original when I get Quark reloaded on my computer and find out why that exists. But with some headlines, part of your style is to put a little extra space above it. And so, even though I don't think I did it here, that would be a telltale sign that I might have, that if that headline gave extra space above the line whenever you hit enter, then that third line could have been caused because I hit enter after the second line. And it thinks this is the first line of the headline. So it gave it some extra space. I don't think I did that, but that's possible. I have to go back and look and see why it's given it extra space. So to do a line break and not have that happen, you hit shift enter. Not enter, but shift enter. So if you want to break a line to keep it from hyphenating, for example, you're safest not to hit enter before the hyphenated word, but hit shift enter, and then you don't run into the problem like this if indeed that was what caused that problem. I don't know. Okay, so headlining by itself is 25% of your grade. I emphasized that before. Try to do a good job with your headlining. That is a major job for the editors. Design and headlining are essential jobs to an editor. So they're both worth 25%. The graphics is a little bit less, 20%. They're also important, but I'm weighing them a little bit less. And how you handle your text is 20%, also a little bit less. But it may not have any less impact because there are actually fewer things under text that you could screw up. And so, for example, under the typography, whether it's appropriate and so forth, I put down here very clearly that for our class, our style is 10-point times New Roman and Arial for headlines. Arial or any sans serif type is okay, as long as it's not too crazy. But sans serif headline, like Arial, and Times New Roman specifically, because we don't want different typefaces with the body text. So even if it's a serif type, no. If I can tell the difference, then it's wrong. If I can't tell the difference, then you got away with it. But Times New Roman, I think every newspaper in the world has a consistent body text rule. And so they set the typeface and they set the type size, and that's their rule. The newspaper I was at before, I'm not sure it used Times New Roman. It might have been a different serif type, but it was 9-point, the daily paper I worked at, because they wanted to squeeze more stories in. So ours is 10-point. Do not go to 12-point. You'll get penalized going to 12 or 11. It's 10. Don't go to 9. Again, one of the pages somebody flashed at me to take an evaluation of went down below 10. No, don't do that. Our style is 10-point, and I'll be very insistent that you keep the style rule for body text 10-point Times New Roman. As I said, every newspaper is consistent in their style for body text. They don't. There might be graphic reasons on a feature page. Feature pages sometimes break rules. So a feature page frequently has one story on the whole page, and therefore they do things a little bit different. And so when I say never, I'm not talking about the feature page. They might do something squirrely, something a little different. But that would be one page out of the entire newspaper that they would do something. And they might, if they have another very special page that, I showed you the idea of a center section where the story went across 2 pages and including the gutter in between. They go ahead and ignore the gutter pretty much and put their story right over the gutter with your, what do they call it? Anyway, with your double pages at the center, with your, I forget what they call it now. Doesn't matter. Anyway, with your double spread, excuse me, that's what you call it. I'm losing my English after 10 years away from America. Anyway, so your double spread, sometimes where you have such a big space and it's all one subject or something, yeah, they'll do something squirrely with that sometimes too. So be sure to keep it the right sizes, the right typefaces. In the past, and in fact, one of the videos we watched, the presenter from Quark kind of explained why he doesn't like justified type either. And I was just watching another one the other day who argued against justified type. And I hate justified type. But most newspapers justify, right and left justify their text. And so for this class, I'm saying you have to justify your text, your body text. Even though I don't with my newspapers. When I own my own newspaper, I don't justify. I don't like it. And I think it's gradually trending away from justification, but not yet. And most newspapers still keep it. I've also talked about vertical justification, and I demonstrate that in my demonstration. I showed you how to line up the bottom lines of all the text. That's called, well, if the bottom lines and the top lines, other than because a picture's interrupting it or something, if the bottom line, the bottom line are lined up, the bottom line of each column is lined up, and the top lines are lined up, then that's vertical justification. And that's also a norm in newspapers. Again, other than interruptions by subheadlines and photos and stuff, lines at the top and lines at the bottom all line up for vertical justification. And to do that, you may have to put some extra leading in some of the paragraphs or some extra space between paragraphs. You may have to do something to push one of the columns down a little further to line up with the other lines. It's either going to come in leading, or it's going to come in line spacing between the paragraphs. Or you can do something like with what I did in one of mine. I demonstrated in the demonstration was I brought the caption down lower, and the caption pushed the column under it down to line up with the other one. So I used my caption as kind of I don't know, as a way to push the text a little bit lower, or not really the caption, but really the text box that held my caption. I brought that text box lower, and it pushed all the text down too. So there are different ways to do it, but you need, if you want to be a professional, you have to line up, you have to have vertical justification too. And so that's number 31, by the way, is vertical justification. We've already talked multiple times about linking your text boxes. Again, I will check any text box that you're going to jump to page 2, I'm going to check to make sure it's linked. And it's very easy to do. All I have to do is click in the box and hit Control A, select all, and it should select all the text in page 1 and page 2. So it takes me 1 second to see if you've linked your text boxes. If you have not, there's definitely a penalty. So I demonstrated that numerous times in my demonstration video, and so this should not be hard to do. Just watch the video. I'm sorry I can't demonstrate it again today, but it's in the demo video I already created, and so there's no excuse not to do it. Make sure you do your jump lines properly. I also went, that was with demonstration 2 that I did not do in this class, but I finished my project outside of class. I think I actually finished it in a tutorial section, but I went ahead and gave it to everybody to show how to finish your page 2. But let's go to the example. Again, I've already said this, but let's make sure you understand, because even things I say 3 or 4 times, sometimes people aren't understanding and you're not asking questions. So again, if I have a jump line, the jump line to page 2 will have, this is called a slug, football here is called a slug. We put a single quote mark around it. Maybe some newspapers put double quote, but most will put a single quote. And that will be the identification on page 2. It won't be the headline, because we're going to change the headline. But the slug on the jump line, right here, football, is what's going to identify the text box linked on the second page. So football continues on page 2. So you don't just say continues on page 2. They won't know what it continues to. And even if you only have one story, it's a terrible habit to get into one jump story. You don't do it anyway. You still need to keep the habit of putting a slug line on the first page and a slug line on the second page. So here is football continues on page 2, and using present tense. And then when we get to page 2, see, that one's on the football story. So on page 2 it says, oops, that's not, oh here, football continues from page 1. So this identifies the jump on page 2 from the story on page 1. Now, as I said, the headlines do change, however. So this headline is for the football stories, Key Map athletes seek to revive school's American football team. But page 2, it says, returning coach enjoys 71 record with the Titans. Now, what I explained the other day, I'm going to explain again. The headline not only should be different, but the headline should emphasize something on page 2. So this information that the coach had a 71 record when he from his previous season, or maybe one game into this new season, that's not on page 1. That's on page 2. his winning record. So that's what I emphasized in this headline, was something on page 2 that I thought was interesting. That this coach who came back, who was gone and then came back, maybe for a graduate degree or something, I can't remember on what basis he came back. They weren't real strict about who they allowed to play on their team, so I think they had some players who weren't students at all. But anyway, he as I said, had a 7-1 record as their coach, and that's on page 2, so that's what I emphasized in the headline on page 2. So the page 2 headline should be different than the page 1 headline, and it should emphasize something on page 2. As I mentioned the other day, same thing with this top headline, the top headline on, or that story, the headline for this story on page 1 is this one over here, the lower right. KeyMap alumnus establishes new hiking club for community. And on page 2, it becomes big and bold at the top of the page because there's a lot of jump to it. And it says hikers feel positive vibes from mountains. And that is only talked about on page 2. That's not on page 1. So this idea that's on the headline on page 2 is uniquely on the jump on page 2. So that's one thing I found myself, again, when I decided to adopt this style as best practices, not necessarily common practice, but best practice, was I found myself reading the jump, finding what I wanted to in the jump. I recognized very quickly that they were making their headlines from information that was only on page 2. And in some cases, I never went back to page 1. So I read the last half of the story. I never read the first half because what I was interested in was in the second half. And I, for whatever reason, decided I didn't think I was interested in what was on page 1. And so in some cases, I went back to page 1 and read the whole story. But in some cases, I never did go back to page 1. I found what I wanted on page 2 and never went back. And the headline helped me figure out if I wanted to read what was on page 2. So I would skim very quickly what was there, find what I wanted to read, and read it. Again, let me emphasize that on page 2, you're only required to jump one story. But if you're going to only jump one story, the other stories need to find a good spot to cut. You don't just leave them in the middle of a sentence. You have to cut them if you're going to leave them on page 1. And it has to be someplace that makes some sense, certainly at the end of a sentence, not in the middle of a sentence. Hopefully, it sounds okay at the sentence you end at. That probably, if it's written in inverted pyramid, it probably will be. It'll be fine wherever you cut it, as long as it's at the end of a sentence. But if it's a direct quote, make sure you have the direct quotes at the end of that sentence too, the quote marks. If you have more than one, you do not have to make the whole page modular, so to speak. You can leave it like I did here, where there's a blank space here and a blank space at the very bottom. That, for this assignment, it's not important. Each story should be modular. If you jump a story, make it modular. But as far as the whole page go, you don't need to make the whole page modular. We can pretend that there's a big ad here and a big ad down here or whatever. We're not going to worry about that for this assignment. On your paragraphs, as I mentioned, if you're thinking in inches, it's about 1/8 of an inch. About 5 millimeters or 1/2 of a centimeter would be the most. And I'm not even sure. I'm not sure. I may need to look at centimeters. That may be too big. Centimeter. Yeah, well, maybe that's okay. That may be about right. But with just looking at it, it should look something like mine, which again, let me blow up again. It should definitely be consistent, and ideally it will be something around this. The indents on news paragraphs is not very big. They're pretty small. These ones look like they could be bigger, or they might be nice to have bigger. Well, let's see. Does this say? Yeah, this is 2 columns across 3, I believe. And so the indent seems a little bit small for this wide of a column. But if you get up, see if I'm right here. Yeah, with these columns, now the indent seems about right. So this is your normal column here, about 2 inches wide. And so with a 2-inch wide column, that sort of an indent is plenty. It just seems a little small when you make your columns wider. Let me emphasize again, don't make your columns too wide. If you had one story on one of your pages that's 2 columns wide, that's okay. Don't make them all 2 columns wide. But you can make one story 2 columns wide to set it apart graphically. That'd be okay. None of mine are 2 columns wide. There's two stories where I make it 1.5 columns wide. One on the front page and one here. In fact, it's the same story. Is 1.5 columns on the front page and 1.5 columns on page 2 also. That helps identify it. And I wouldn't overdo it. Some newspapers make a lot of different sizes and it starts getting a little bit dizzy, so to speak. It's like having too many graphics when you have too many different column sizes. It looks odd. And so I don't encourage breaking the standard column size very often. I would rather you do more or less what I did. Most of them have your standard 6-column format, and once in a while break it to where you have 2 columns across 3, or 2 columns of text across 3 columns in the grid. Something like that. But definitely never go more than 2 columns wide, and do not go 2 columns wide with, well, maybe 1 story. You might go that much, but not more than 1 story. Don't go more than 2. Be sure to keep your paragraphs short. I've seen some where paragraphs are quite long. I myself may combine paragraphs if I need to in order to create vertical justification. And so in some of mine, I did combine some paragraphs because that did away with a line. And so I had one line that was longer than the other. So to get rid of that extra line, I combined a short paragraph with another short paragraph so that it got rid of a line. And so in editing process, you may end up with some paragraphs that are more than 3 sentences, but that should only be rare. And that should be very purposeful. And in this case, the only reason I can think of for doing it is vertical justification. Otherwise, you're as an editor, you should keep them below, no more than 3 sentences long as an editor, with that exception. Okay, I think I covered the critique sheet again, and I'm sorry if some of you are bored by the redundancy, but as I said, when I saw some really good students making mistakes, it was obviously they didn't get it the first time. And so if they didn't get it, I have to presume others didn't get it also. And I was going to cover the critique sheet again as I was actually doing a new demonstration, but as for those that were here on time, my Quark ran out. I had a month-long Quark subscription of this computer, and it ran out apparently today. So I couldn't use it in class. Wasn't aware it ran out. We'll have some more demonstrations probably next week. I'll spend some time demonstrating. I'll demonstrate the next project. If not next week, the week after that, I'm not sure. I should probably do it next week because next Monday, as you remember, is your deadline for this project. It's midnight next Monday. I sent you a note about some lab time. Hopefully you all got that note. But in case you did not, let me open up my lab schedule so you can see it. So today, right after this class, 104 will be open if anybody wants to go over to 104 and work in the Apple lab. But this afternoon, 105 will be open. So FISA should be in those rooms respectively. Apple in the morning, Windows in the afternoon. It's in the 105 is right next to 104, kind of, yeah, across the little hallway there. Tomorrow, it'll be just the opposite. We're having to schedule it because differently because there are classes in the Windows lab sometimes. So we have to work around their schedule. So tomorrow, Windows will be in the morning, 11 to 1 o'clock, and then the Apple lab will be open in the afternoon. On Wednesday, only the app we could only gain access to the Apple lab, so that'll be all Apple. But then nothing on Thursday because we leave that room open for Luis's classes on Thursday. And then on Friday, you have 4 hours in the Windows lab if you want them in the morning, starting at 8 o'clock. So all morning Windows lab on Friday. On Monday, next Monday, a week from today, I have scheduled the Windows lab 105 from 4 o'clock until 8 o'clock. So you have those who need to use a Windows lab to finish this project. You will have those 4 hours. You should start it before then. 4 hours may not be enough to finish it. It's long enough for me, but it may not be long enough for you, right? So I wouldn't bet on being able to finish it in 4 hours. I will be probably overseeing that lab in the green myself. Faiza will have gone home by then, probably, or she might oversee part of it, and I'll take over when she has to leave. So, yeah. So I'm trying to set up as much time as possible. About half of you have downloaded Quark into your own computers. Those of you who have not, it's up to you. These are the lab times we can give to you. I believe Quark has also been added to the labs downstairs. I know they've been added to the labs downstairs, 10 and 11. And I think they may have been added to the labs over in the B building, but I don't know what their hours are. So I'm just showing you the hours that I know that we control. Basically, we've scheduled these lab hours so we know we control them. If you can get into one of the other labs at some other time, go for it. I just don't know when they're open for anybody to go into. And as far from what I understand from FISA, they're not being controlled. They're not being scheduled for open lab a lot. So it's very hit and miss. One other thing I want you to, that you need to know is Academic Affairs has decided that the final exam will be only in Windows. So they're only going to schedule, 105 again and also 10 and 11 in A1, 10, 11, I mean. A1, 10, 11, and A1, 105 will all be used during the final exam, but no Apple. So I think most of you who have Apple laptops also know how to use Windows. You're not as handicapped as those who only know Windows and haven't learned Apple. So it probably won't cause you a problem, but in case it does, you need to know that now. You need to get used to Quark in Windows. Yeah. I wanted to, oh, by the way, I was going to say on Monday, I did say this in my message, when I'm overseeing A5, 105, I will also, if students want to be in the Apple lab, if you prefer doing your homework in Apple and want to use the Apple lab, I will open the lab, but basically I'm going to name somebody in charge, and that person has to represent me to make sure nothing weird happens in the Apple lab when I'm in 105, right across the hall. And of course, I'll be coming in and peeking in once in a while myself. But if people want to use the Apple lab while I'm in the Windows lab across the hall, I will open it up for you on Monday, 4 to 8 o'clock. So that will be available to you. Okay, any questions on anything? Hopefully, when you're done with this assignment, this will be a learning experience. I don't expect you to do perfectly on this. but it is frustrating to me. I'm sorry if I show my frustration when I go over something 3 or 4 times in class and people don't capture it, don't get it. I'm frustrated with myself if I'm not slowing down my speech and so that more of you can understand me. And I'm frustrated if you're not doing what you need to do to understand me, whether watching the videos again and turning on the subtitles or whatever you need to do. And one thing you can do for sure is of all the documents that are important, it's the critique sheets. If you don't understand one word I say, there's no excuse not to go to the critique sheets and translate what's in the critique sheets. If you have to translate them to understand them. Now, translation may not be perfect, but you really need to understand these critique sheets. That's how I'm grading them. And so, I've tried to say that many times in many different ways as I can. It is really foolish not to know what's in the critique sheet. I've had students, not just here, students in Kazakhstan who go through the entire semester and apparently never wanted to read the critique sheet, no matter what it did to their grade. And I can't understand that. That boggles my mind. I do go a little bit different than most. I kind of resist going with the I try to do this in a way that is very clear what to do to get an A. And anybody who keeps this critique sheet religiously should get an A. I don't tell you how to get a B. I figure you can figure out how to get a B pretty easily by knowing how to get an A and just don't do so well. So if you want to get a B, just don't do everything on the critique sheet. If you want to get a C, don't do anything on the critique sheet, basically. That's how you get a B or a C. So I figure that's pretty easy to figure out. So I tell you how to get an A. Just do what's in the critique sheet. Now, if you don't understand, I can't read your minds. I'm seeing a lot of faces there that are, I know some of you are making mistakes and you probably have questions and you won't ask me the question. This is frustrating to me. If you have a question, I guarantee somebody else has the same question. And I want to answer that question. So please, anybody with any question about this, ask it. Throw my glasses. See all these hands up. I guess I don't need my glasses. Okay. Well, I think I covered what I wanted to cover, especially without having quarked in the computer this morning. Again, for those who came in late, I sent around the PowerPoint, the presentation sheet, so you could double check. And one of the things I was asking you to double check is right now we're getting into a stage where some of you are doing one half of a chapter and somebody else is doing the other half of a chapter. You need to know who's doing the other half of the chapter so you can decide how to split it. Now, in some cases, like in this case, I told you how to split it, those that were here on time. I told you how to split this, but I didn't tell you how to split the other chapters because I'm not going to. I can let you guys can get together with your partner. You're not doing it on the same day even. Most of you who are splitting a chapter are not doing it on the same day. One person's doing it one week and one doing it next week. So split it someplace logical. I don't mind if there's a little bit of redundancy, if you think you need to be a little bit redundant. For example, in writing headlines, in comparing headlines with subheadlines and subtitles and blurbs, and pull-out quotes or whatever else you're covering. Yeah, you may want to refer to a rule in how to do headlines, even though your partner already covered headlines. But you're doing it the next week. You're kind of comparing your subheadlines to headlines. You may talk a little bit about the headlines. I know most of you will benefit from getting a double dose of headlines, probably. And you may find a little bit of that in some of the other chapters where a little bit of overlap would not matter. But There's several chapters here that are split, and so figure out who's doing what. And like somebody asked me yesterday, when theirs was. Of course, you need to know when your assignment is. So you should have written that down by now. And you need to know, again, if you're splitting a chapter with somebody, you need to know who the other person is. Even though you're not really partners, because like I said, you're going to be doing it in different weeks. So you're not going to be up there at the same time. But you do need to know who your partner is, in a sense, who's doing the same chapter with you, so you don't screw it up too bad. Okay. So you should have that passed around. What else? This week in your tutorial, we will have the student presentations, but other than that, I'll just have you work on your assignments. So if you downloaded into your laptop, bring your laptop so you can work on it if you want to use your laptop. Otherwise, if you want to do your work on the Apples, it'll be in the Apple lab. But at that hour, we won't be able to get into the Windows lab. So either you have it in your laptop, you work on it there. If you don't want to use Apple and you don't have a laptop, I'll let you go early. You won't have to stay. You don't have to stay for the whole tutorial. You should come at least for the student presentations. And then if you don't have a laptop with Quark on it, you don't. Now, again, I don't know why you wouldn't want Quark on your laptop, unless it's just plain you have no memory on it. You have no storage left to put it on. But I guess I can understand that. But at least half of you, or about half of you, have not loaded into your laptop. Again, FISA is in charge of most of these labs. You can come get Quark loaded into your laptop when she's during any of these open labs, when she's there. She can do that for you. And other times, she has an office in this building, 112 upstairs. So today, right now, if I let you out early, you might catch her in her office. Otherwise, she's going to go, and she will be in 104 starting at 11 o'clock at the end of this class. So, or I guess that's a little bit, an hour later, I guess, than this class. So you catch her in 104 and get it loaded then. If you can possibly put it in your laptop, I would encourage you to do it just so you get more practice, you have more exposure to it. There's some things about desktop publishing that you won't figure out until you actually do it. And that's why I make you do it in this class. If I teach you and grade you only by multiple choice quizzes, you won't know how to do desktop publishing. It will still be totally strange to you when you go looking for a real job. It's really important that you do this stuff, that you use it. Just the same as when you're taking the video classes, you need to actually do it. You need to do the editing. You need to learn by doing it. You're going to make mistakes the first time. You're going to make mistakes with desktop publishing the first time. But the more you use it, the more you'll perfect your skills with it, the faster you'll be at it. The easier it'll be for you to get a job when you want to go out in the real world. My marketing jobs depended also on my desktop publishing. I mean, I learned desktop publishing as a journalist and as a professor at the same time. I was at the daily newspaper and teaching at a local university at the same time. And so we're doing the student newspaper and desktop publishing, a kind that doesn't exist anymore. And we were, I probably mentioned this before, but during that transition period, I find this principle to be true about most software, but anyway, during that transition period when we were still confused, when Windows did not dominate, and Apple was just coming into a fairly dominant position, we had pagination systems at the daily newspaper that were literally this big as the size of this lectern. I told you before, but that's how big it was. It had two keyboards, a joystick, move the cursor around, two monitors on it, and that was our version of desktop publishing at the daily newspaper, and it cost each of the machines in 1986 money was $100,000. So not everybody could have have desktop publishing in 1986, or at least 1985. In 1987 was when I took over at the same time when I was working at the Daily, took over the student newspaper and the journalism classes in the university. And that was when I first became proficient at real desktop publishing. In that case, we used one called Ventura, a program called Ventura. I think one of the presenters talks about Ventura, so he must be an old guy too, like me, because I don't think that lasted more than about 4 years before it disappeared. But and then at the same time, I think about 2 years later, I got PageMaker, the predecessor to InDesign, loaded, and I started teaching a class just in desktop publishing, not related to journalism. It's open to anybody. And so that's where I said as far as I know, it's the first desktop publishing class in any university in the world. In 1988 or 89, probably 89, was when I started offering it as a class to anybody. Before that, I was just teaching it to my journalism students to do the student newspaper. There's a video that I sometimes have my students in my success strategy class watch. It was by an associate of Steve Jobs, who said that desktop publishing is what saved Apple. Apple might not have survived without desktop publishing, which is, by the way, one reason why I encourage you to learn Apple. I'm old. I'm probably always going to prefer Windows. I don't know. Maybe I'll buy myself an Apple next year. I might do it. But Apple is the preferred computer for most designers, which is one reason why I encourage you to learn the Apple, even if you don't own one. Learn how to use it, because you may get a job that requires you to use Apple. Because desktop publishing and Apple have gone together since 1986, 87, and it saved the company because the designers then strongly preferred using Quark with Apple in those days. Quark was only for Apple, and PageMaker was only for Windows in those days. Since then, PageMaker and InDesign started taking over more of the market. It became available in Apple. And I don't know exactly why Quark didn't compete better. I think having used Quark now for a couple of weeks, I prefer Quark over InDesign. So if I have to buy my own software here, which I probably will soon, I'm going to be doing some book publishing starting in September, and with my own company, which is why I'm taking a leave of absence. I know a lot of you already know that. I'm taking a leave of absence, and I'm starting a company. I have a tremendous opportunity to start my own publishing company again. And I will probably buy Quark. When I started my last newspaper, we at that time we didn't test Quark. But we compared. At that time, Adobe was still selling PageMaker, but it was also selling InDesign. And so I had my entire staff who did desktop publishing anyway, test both of them. And I tested both of them at that time. And we all agreed that PageMaker was better for a journalist. PageMaker was simpler than InDesign. It was not quite so, I'm not sure the right word. You could be perhaps a true designer who all they had to do all day was just design stuff, might find advantages to InDesign. But to a newspaper person who's even as meticulous as I am, and I'm quite meticulous, I think you would all say, and maybe you think I'm over meticulous in my vertical justification, all that sort of stuff. I'm not overly, but you might think I am. But even for somebody as meticulous as I am as a copy editor, I felt like PageMaker was absolutely fine, and it was faster than InDesign. I did not want to go to InDesign. And I would still not be using InDesign if I had a choice. And Kazakhstan, we ended up buying InDesign only because they stopped selling PageMaker. I tried to convince them to let me go buy used copies of PageMaker on Craigslist or something, but they wouldn't do that. Even though it makes sense, universities don't always make sense. So we had to buy InDesign. And I taught it and I used it in my editing class, but it's not my preference. And now I would say my point is, if I had to choose again, it would now be Quark. For two reasons. One, because I think it is easier than InDesign, faster than InDesign, more intuitive than InDesign. I guess more than one thing. But also, it is, well, it's about the same price if you're paying full price. Now, again, they're selling it to us for 1,000 licenses for $1,000, which is not full price. Because a full price is about $800 and something for one license. We're getting 1,000 licenses for $1,000, which is why you all get to load it to your computers if you want it. So that's basically what PageMaker did back in 1988 when I was teaching that first desktop publishing class. We decided to add PageMaker to the class to let people learn both, either or both PageMaker and Ventura that we were using then in the journalism class. But it's because PageMaker, or Adobe, made it such a good deal. They sold it to us so cheap that we figured we couldn't hardly turn it down. So that's how Adobe gained their monopoly in desktop publishing, was that they went to this university and they gave it away cheap to the university students, and that led into the industry. So now Quark is doing it. Quark is now offering 1,000 licenses for $1,000, and they're hoping to get back into the market and compete with Adobe. And the other advantage is Adobe no longer sells a permanent license. Adobe now makes you pay it month by month, year by year. You never pay off your Adobe license now, whereas Quark allows you to buy a permanent license and then stop paying. So it's in that sense it's cheaper than Adobe because you don't have to upgrade if you don't want to. The current version is fine, and you can keep it for the next 20 years, in theory anyway, and never have to buy a new license. So, okay, well, I don't know if any of that was useful to you, but we are now out of time, and so I'll stop the discussion there. Again, if some of you have questions and you're too shy to ask them in front of everybody, I will answer your questions individually. Okay, thank you.